Somewhere above the city, snow is melting. It happens every spring on the south face of the Alborz. The pack softens. The water finds a channel. The channel finds a river. The Karaj, the Jarud, the Talakan. 3 rivers coming off the same wall of rock. By the time that water reaches a tap on the 10th floor of an apartment block, it has been dammed, stored, tunneled, filtered, chlorinated, and dropped nearly 200 meters. It has crossed 100 kilometers of pipe. Nobody watches any of that happen. You turn the handle. Water comes out. The mountains directly north of this city are among the wettest ground in Western Asia. On their northern face, rain and snow deliver between 1,000 and 2,000 millimeters a year. The forest up there is thick enough to feel tropical. Moss on the trunks, clouds sitting in the valleys most of the year. Tehran, on the other side, receives about 200. Both figures are correct. A single ridge separates them. The air comes in off the Caspian, climbs the northern slope, and drops almost everything it carries on the way up. By the time it crosses the crest, it has nothing left to give. What arrives on the southern side is dry air over dry ground, and below that ground, the beginning of a desert. So Tehran sits in a strange position. It is one of the driest large cities in the region, and it is 30 kilometers from some of the wettest terrain in the country. The water is right there. It is simply on the wrong side. Everything this city has built for the last 70 years is an answer to that one problem. 5 reservoirs sit in the mountains above the city. Between them, they deliver a little over 1 billion cubic meters a year, and that covers roughly 70% of what Tehran drinks. The rest comes from underground. The 5 have names: Amir Kabir, Latian, La, Talakan, Mamlu. They are not a system that was designed. They are a system that accumulated, one dam at a time, each one built because the one before it had stopped being enough. In the autumn of a recent year, the largest of them was measured at 14 million cubic meters of stored water. That is 8% of what it holds when it is full. A year earlier, the same reservoir had held 86 million. The city drinks around 3 million cubic meters a day. You can do that arithmetic yourself. It was done publicly at the time, and the answer came back in days rather than months. 14 of them, 2 weeks. Now, that number is not a prophecy. It is a division problem. A stated volume divided by a stated rate of draw. And like most division problems, it hides more than it explains, because it treats a city's water as a quantity sitting in a tank. It isn't a quantity, it's a chain. Snowfall on a ridge, a river, a dam wall, a turbine, a tunnel, a filter bed, a pressure zone, a pump, a pipe with a joint in it that was laid 40 years ago. Every link depends on the one before it, and 1 or 2 of them depend on things nobody thinks of as water at all. So the question worth asking is not how much was left, it is, what exactly was that number counting? The first thing to understand about Tehran is that it is not flat, and the entire water system is built on that fact. The northern edge of the city, at Tajrish, sits at about 1,310 meters. The southern edge, down by the old railway station, sits at about 1,100. That is roughly 200 meters of drop across the width of a metropolis, an average grade of about 13%. Walk it and you feel it in your knees. Drive it and you can put the car in neutral. That slope is not decoration. It is the machine. Water leaves the mountains at altitude and arrives in the city already carrying the energy it needs to distribute itself. It does not have to be pushed. It has to be released, carefully, in stages, into pressure zones that step down the hill so that the pipes at the bottom are not destroyed by the weight of the water at the top. A city on level ground pumps its water. Every litre costs electricity. Tehran, for most of its network, does not. It falls. That is why the north of the city has always had reliable pressure and the south has always had less. It is why a building at the bottom of the slope keeps a storage tank on the roof and a small pump in the basement, and a building at the top does not need either. And it explains something that seems strange the first time you hear it. When this city has to reduce supply, it does not usually turn the water off. It turns the pressure down. Lower the head, and water stops climbing to the upper floors. The lower floors keep flowing. The high ones go quiet. Nothing has been switched off exactly. The machine is simply running with less push behind it, and gravity decides who still gets served. Remember that. It comes back later, and when it does, it will explain something about the shape of this city that has nothing to do with plumbing. Northwest of Tehran, the Karaj River comes down out of the Alborz through a valley narrow enough that the road has to cling to one wall of it. 63 kilometers from the city, the valley pinches almost shut. That pinch is the reason everything else happened. Construction started here in 1957. What went up in the gap was a concrete arch, 180 meters tall, 390 meters across the crest, curved upstream so that the weight of the reservoir presses the structure harder into the rock on either side rather than pushing it over. By 1961, it was closed. The valley filled. Behind the wall sat 202 million cubic meters of water where there had been a river. They named it Amir Kabir, after Mirza Taghi Khan Amir Kabir, a 19th century chief minister remembered for building the country's first modern institutions and for being removed from power for it. Putting his name on the wall was a statement about what the dam was supposed to be. Not a reservoir, a foundation. The pipe came first, though. That is the part people forget. Water had been taken from the Karaj River since 1949, and by 1951 there was a plan for something more serious. 2 steel lines running from an intake at Bilkan down out of the valley into a new treatment plant at Jalalia on the western edge of the city. 24,000 cubic meters a day. Enough for a population of about 900,000. The line opened in 1955. The dam that filled it opened 6 years later. That order matters. Tehran built the delivery system first and then went looking for something to put in it. And it has been doing exactly that ever since. Here is how the Karaj corridor actually works. Snowmelt and rain gather across the upper catchment and arrive behind the wall. The reservoir does 2 jobs at once, and this is the part that decides more than anything else in this story. Job 1. It stores. Water arrives in a rush in spring and is needed steadily all year, so the dam holds the difference. It converts a seasonal river into a constant supply. Job 2. It generates. There is a 90 megawatt power station at the base of that wall, and every cubic meter released through the turbines is paid for twice. Once as electricity, once as drinking water downstream. That sounds like efficiency. For 50 years it was. But it means the reservoir is answering to 2 different clocks. The water system wants the level high, because a high level is stored security. The power system wants water moving, because water sitting still generates nothing. And it means the dam has 2 floors, not 1. Below a certain level, the intakes for the power station are above the waterline. The turbines stop. There is still water in the reservoir, a great deal of it, but it can no longer do the second job. The level at which a dam stops making electricity is not the level at which it stops supplying water. The first floor is always higher than the second. Hold on to that, because it means something specific. Long before a reservoir like this runs out of drinking water, it goes quiet as a power station. The lights it was feeding have to come from somewhere else. And some of what that electricity was doing, in a city that lifts water into storage tanks, that runs treatment plants, that drives every pump in every basement at the bottom of the hill, was moving water. From Bilkan, the water goes to treatment. Tehran has 5 major plants, and between them, they handle supply for a metropolitan population somewhere above 12 million. The process is not exotic. Coagulant is added so that the fine suspended particles clump into flocks heavy enough to sink. The flocks settle out in sedimentation basins. What is left passes down through sand filters, then gets a dose of chlorine calculated to survive the whole journey ahead, because chlorine is consumed as it travels, and the last apartment on the line needs some left when the water arrives. That last detail is worth sitting with. The dose at the plant is set by the length of the pipe. And the pipe is long. Roughly 100 kilometers of transmission before you even reach the distribution network. And the distribution network is old. Somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the water that leaves the treatment plants never arrives anywhere. It leaks. Not dramatically. There is no fountain in the street. It seeps out of joints and hairline cracks in buried mains, most of them laid decades ago, and it disappears into the gravel under the city. Which means the machine has a strange property. Roughly 1 liter in 3 or 4 that this city pulls out of its mountains, treats, chlorinates and pressurizes is being returned to the ground it came from, unmetered, unbilled, and impossible to find without digging. Keep that in mind too. Where that water goes turns out to matter enormously. 25 kilometers from the center of the city, up past Lavasan, a second river comes down a second valley, the Jarud. And across it, closing the gap in 1967, sits the Latian Dam. 107 meters of buttress dam, 95 million cubic meters behind it, 45 megawatts at the foot. On paper, it is a smaller copy of the first one. Same idea, same era, same double duty. But Latian sits close. Amir Kabir is 63 kilometers out, Latian is 25, and the difference is not just distance, it is time. A reservoir close to the city responds fast. When demand spikes on a hot week, Latian can be drawn down quickly, and the effect is felt in the network within hours. It is the reservoir the system leans on when it needs an answer immediately. Which is exactly why it is the one with the least margin. The reservoir that is easiest to reach is the reservoir that gets used first. It is drawn on hardest, refilled slowest, and it spends most of its year lower than the ones further away. Proximity in a water system is not an advantage. It is a tax. And there is a 6th reservoir above all of them that nobody built. Snow. On the high ground of the Alborz, precipitation that falls between late autumn and early spring does not run off. It sits, sometimes for months, and releases slowly as it melts through the warming season. That is storage. Free storage, at altitude, upstream of every dam in the system. And it is the reason the rivers below run through summer at all in a place where the rain stops in May. A concrete wall holds water for a year. The snowpack holds it for a season, but it also decides the shape of the year. Because the dams are not sized to hold everything, they are sized to smooth what arrives, and what arrives depends on how the snow comes down. A cold winter that builds a deep pack and melts it slowly delivers water in a long, manageable curve, and the reservoirs capture nearly all of it. A warm winter that falls as rain instead of snow, or a pack that melts fast in a sudden spring, delivers the same total volume in a fraction of the time. And a reservoir cannot store what arrives faster than it can hold. The surplus goes over the spillway and downstream, out of the system in a week. So the same annual rainfall figure can produce two completely different years, depending entirely on the temperature at which it landed. The gauge measures the water. It does not measure whether the mountain kept it. So there are two rivers, two dams, two power stations, and a city sitting downhill of both. That was the arrangement for a long time. It was not enough, but the reason it was not enough is not the reason most people assume. To understand that, you have to go to the low end of the slope, where the city is oldest, and find out why anybody stopped here in the first place. 10 kilometers south of the modern center, at the bottom of the grade, there is a mound. It is called Cheshme Ali, and it sits in Shah-e-Ray, a city that was already ancient when Tehran was still a village of gardens and orchards a short ride to the north. The name means the Spring of Ali. There was, and to a much lesser degree still is, water coming out of the rock here. People have been settling around it for something close to 8,000 years. The pottery pulled out of the mound dates to around 6,000 years before the Common Era, which makes this one of the oldest continuously inhabited spots on the Iranian plateau. And the reason is geology, not luck. The southern flank of the Alborz sheds enormous volumes of debris. Torrents coming off the high peaks carry rock down onto the plain and drop it where the gradient flattens, building vast alluvial fans of gravel spread across the Piedmont. Tehran is built on those fans. The material sorts itself by size. Up near the mountains, the deposits are coarse, big, loose gravel with wide gaps between the stones. Water poured onto that ground vanishes straight down. Further south, the particles get finer, silts and clays. The gaps close. Water can no longer sink. So groundwater flowing south underneath the gravel hits that finer material like a wall, backs up, and rises toward the surface. That is what a spring is here, not a source, a collision. And the old settlement sits exactly on the seam between the two zones, where the water table, dozens of meters down at the northern edge, comes close enough to the surface that a person with a bucket can reach it. Everything about the early city is that seam. Ray grew on it. The gardens grew on it. Tehran, further up the slope, grew because the seam was reachable there too, with a bit more effort. Which brings us to the effort. Somewhere in the last 3,000 years, on this plateau, someone worked out how to move the seam. The technique is called a qanat. The principle is almost absurdly simple, and the execution is not. You find the water table where it is high, up in the alluvial gravel near the mountains, and you sink a shaft down to it. That is the mother well. Then, from a point far downhill where you want the water to arrive, you begin digging a tunnel back towards that well, underground, at a gradient shallower than the slope of the land above. The land drops faster than the tunnel does, so the tunnel, which started deep, gets closer and closer to the surface as it runs. Eventually, it breaks out into daylight, and water comes out of a hillside where there was no water before. No pump, no power. Gravity and a slope of a fraction of a percent held over kilometers of hand-dug tunnel in the dark. Every 30 meters or so along the route, a vertical shaft goes up to the surface. For spoil removal during construction, for air, and for the maintenance men who would spend their whole working lives crawling that tunnel, keeping it clear. From the air, an old qanat looks like a line of craters marching down a hillside. Perfect circles, evenly spaced, running for kilometers toward nothing. There were around 50,000 of them across the country, more than 200 of them under Tehran alone, with a combined length somewhere near 2,000 kilometers. 2,000 kilometers of hand-dug tunnel under a modern capital. And here is the property that matters most, the one that took a very long time to appreciate properly. A qanat cannot over-extract. It is a passive drain. It takes only what the water table delivers to the height of the tunnel. If the table drops, a dry decade, less snow, the flow falls and eventually stops. The tunnel does not chase the water down. It has no capacity to. That is not a design flaw. It is a governor. The system had a hard ceiling built into its physics, and the ceiling was the aquifer's own recharge rate. You could not take more than the ground was replacing, because the moment you tried, there was nothing in the channel to take. For roughly 2.5 millennia, that was how this plateau drank. A technology that could not be pushed beyond what it was owed. And then, over the space of about 30 years, it was replaced. The deep well arrived. A drilled bore, a submersible pump, an electrical connection. It takes what you tell it to take. If the water table drops, you lower the pump and keep going. There was nothing conspiratorial about the switch. A well is cheaper than a qanat, takes days rather than decades to build, does not need a specialist workforce, and delivers more water per hour on demand. Against a growing population and a push for domestic food production, it won on every measure anyone was using at the time. Across the country, the number of wells climbed steeply through the second half of the 20th century. Around Tehran, the qanats went quiet, one after another. Not because they were closed, because the wells beside them lowered the water table below the level of the tunnels, and the tunnels simply stopped running. The old system was not switched off, it was drained out from underneath. Nobody filled in the tunnels. 2,000 kilometers of them, under a city that was about to build 7 metro lines, 300 kilometers of track, and the tallest buildings on the plateau. The oldest one still holding water is called Mehgerd. It runs beneath a dense district of the modern city, and it is roughly 700 years old. It has been draining groundwater without maintenance for more than 60 years. There is no crew anymore. No one crawls it. It is simply still there, doing what it was dug to do, under the traffic. It is easy to tell this as a story of something lost, and it is one. But that is not really the point. The point is that the qanat and the deep well are not two ways of doing the same job. They are two entirely different relationships with the same body of water. One takes the interest, the other takes the principle. Northeast of the city, on the flank of a volcano, is the strangest thing this system contains. Mount Damavand rises more than 5,600 meters, a symmetrical cone, snow on it most of the year, visible from Tehran on a clear day, and mythologized in Persian literature for as long as there has been Persian literature. At its foot runs the La River, through a high valley of limestone and volcanic rock. Between 1974 and 1980, a dam was built across that valley. The plan was straightforward: capture the La and tunnel its water south through the mountain into the Latian system, adding a third river to a city that had two. The wall went up, the valley began to fill, and the water started to disappear. Not over the spillway, not through the wall. Down. Springs on the far side of the mountain, in the Haraz Valley, in the Galuga Valley, draining north toward the Caspian, began running harder. Sinkholes opened in the floor of the new reservoir. The water was leaving the reservoir underground and coming out on the other side of the range. The rock explains it, and the explanation is remarkable. Limestone dissolves in slightly acidic water. Over long enough spans, that dissolution carves conduits, not cracks, but open channels, sometimes large enough to walk through, threading through the body of the mountain. That is karst. And this particular mountain had been making karst for a very long time under ideal conditions. In the Pleistocene, an eruption of Damavand poured lava across the La Valley and dammed the river. A lake formed behind the lava and stood there for thousands of years. All that time, water under pressure was working downward through the limestone beneath, dissolving pathways toward the springs on the northern side. When the natural lake eventually drained, the conduits stayed, empty but intact. Then, in 1980, engineers filled the same valley again. The reservoir did not create the leak, it reopened one. The old channels had been sitting there, dry, for the whole of human history, waiting for someone to put a lake back on top of them. The volumes involved are hard to hold in your head. Measurements of the leakage have ranged from 3 to 13 cubic meters per second, with sustained figures around 8 to 11. 8 cubic meters a second is 8,000 liters every second going the wrong way through a mountain. Grouting began in 1983, pumping cement slurry into the rock under pressure to seal the paths. It ran for 6 years. It did not work. You can seal a crack. You cannot reliably seal a conduit system you cannot map, in rock that dissolves, under a head of water that will find the next path as fast as you close the last one. 3.5 decades after it began operating, the reservoir was impounding around 40% of the capacity it was designed for. The dam is not a failure in the ordinary sense. It works. It delivers real water south through the mountain to the city, and it has done so for over 40 years. It is just that the mountain takes a share first, and the share is not negotiable. There is something clarifying in that, and it goes beyond one reservoir. Every other part of this system can be argued with. You can build a bigger pipe, raise a wall, drill deeper, add a plant. Each of those is a decision, and decisions can be revisited. The karst under Damavand is not a decision. It is a fact about the rock, established several 100,000 years before anyone arrived to build anything. And it sets a ceiling that no amount of engineering has moved. Remember the ridge at the start, the wall that decides which side of the mountain the rain falls on. Here is the same ruling, delivered underground. Water that Tehran captured on the southern slope is being returned to the northern watershed through channels the volcano cut, and it is going to the Caspian the way it always did. The mountain does not care which side the city is on. Northwest again, in the mountains of Alborz province, a fourth river was dammed in 2006, the Talakan. 109 meters of wall, 420 million cubic meters behind it, 18 megawatts at the base. On paper, it is the largest storage of the five. It is also the furthest away, and that is the problem it was built to have. Water in a reservoir 140 kilometers from the city is not the city's water until something carries it there. So a pipeline was laid, from an intake at Tehran, across the intervening country, down to the treatment works that serve Karaj, and beyond them, Tehran. 62 kilometers of it. Pipe 2 meters in diameter. Something in the order of 43,000 tons of steel put into the ground. It was designed to move 5 cubic meters per second. Here is what that means in the context of the city it feeds. Tehran draws in the region of 40,000 liters per second. The first stage of that pipeline delivered around 2,200. 5.5%, 62 kilometers of 2-meter steel, one of the more difficult civil projects the country has attempted, and the answer it returns is around 1/20th of the daily draw. That is not a criticism of the pipeline. It is the arithmetic of scale, and it is the single most useful thing to understand about big city water anywhere. A metropolis of 10 million does not have a water problem that can be solved by any one object. The demand is so large that even a very good addition arrives as a percentage in the low single figures. Which is why the answer, when supply gets tight, is almost never a new source. It is pressure. Go back to the slope. 200 meters of drop, and a network that distributes by falling. Reduce the head at the top of a zone, and consumption falls across the whole zone at once. Not because anyone was persuaded, but because water that cannot climb to a 10th floor tank is water that does not get used. Overnight, when demand is lowest and reservoirs are refilling, the pressure comes down. In some districts, it goes very low indeed. Nothing is announced. Nothing is switched. The machine simply runs softer for 6 hours, and the buildings with a tank and a basement pump barely notice, while the buildings without one wake up to nothing in the taps. That is the 13% grade, still doing its work. The oldest fact about this city, that it is built on a hill, is the fact that decides, at 4 in the morning, whose water still runs. There is one more consumer in this system, and it is the one nobody counts. Look at the roofline of almost any building in this city, and you will see it. A box. Steel, usually painted, about the size of a chest freezer, sitting on the flat roof with a duct running down into the building. It is an evaporative cooler. Locally, they are simply called coolers, and they are on hundreds of thousands of roofs. The physics is elegant. A pump wets a set of porous pads. A fan pulls outside air through them. The water in the pads evaporates, and evaporation takes energy. The heat comes out of the air passing through, and the air that reaches the room is markedly cooler than the air outside. In a dry climate, it works extremely well. In a humid one, it barely works at all, because the air is already carrying as much moisture as it can hold. On a plateau with 200 millimeters of annual rainfall, it is close to ideal. But the cooling is the evaporation. That is not a byproduct. That is the mechanism, which means the machine's entire function is to take drinking water and put it into the sky. A single unit consumes somewhere between 30 and 45 litres an hour while running. Multiply that by the hours in a hot day, the days in a long summer, and the number of roofs. One published estimate put national consumption by evaporative coolers across a single summer at somewhere between 570 and 850 million cubic metres. Take the midpoint, around 700 million. Set that against the reservoir we started with. Amir Kabir holds 202 million cubic metres when it is completely full. The coolers, in one summer, consume something on the order of 3 to 4 times the entire capacity of the largest reservoir in the system. Not 3 or 4 times what the reservoir released, 3 or 4 times what it can physically contain. And every litre of it was treated to drinking standard, chlorinated, pressurised and lifted to a roof, so that it could be turned into vapour and lost. There is a link inside that worth naming because it closes a circuit. The hotter the summer, the more the coolers run. The more they run, the more water is drawn and the more electricity the fans and pumps consume. And the same heat that drives them is the heat that raises evaporation off the open reservoirs. And the same dry year that raised the temperature lowered the level behind the dams, the level at which the turbines at the foot of those dams stop generating. So the demand peak and the generation trough are the same event. The system's hardest day is the day it has least to work with. That is not bad luck. That is how it is wired. There is one component of this machine that has no pipe, no pump, and no wall, and it may be the one with the most leverage: the meter. Planning for this city works from an allocation of about 130 litres per person per day. That figure is not arbitrary. It is roughly the international benchmark for domestic use, and the network was sized around it. Actual consumption runs at somewhere between 200 and 400 litres. Around 70% of households exceed the allocation, and the average sits near double it. That gap is not really a gap in behaviour, it is a gap in information. A meter is a signalling device. It is the only part of the system that reaches into a kitchen and reports back what the mountains can afford. And in a system where the tariff sits well below the cost of providing the water, in one recent assessment, urban consumers covered a little over half of it, the signal it sends is quiet. The consequence runs both directions, and this is the part that gets missed. Revenue below cost does not just encourage use, it starves the utility of the money it needs to find and repair the leaks in its own network. So a low price produces higher consumption at one end of the pipe and worse losses at the other, and both effects land on the same reservoir. 180 metres of concrete arch is the visible engineering. The number on a bill is the invisible engineering, and it is doing at least as much work. Follow the water once more, all the way to the bottom. Everything that leaves a tap in this city and goes down a drain runs downhill, because everything here runs downhill. It gathers in the sewer network and arrives at the southern edge of the city, where the largest treatment plant in Tehran sits at the low end of the slope. What comes out the other side is not drinking water. It is treated effluent, settled, biologically digested, chlorinated, clean enough for some things and not others. And it does not get thrown away. It goes out into the plain south and east of the city and irrigates farmland. Somewhere in the order of 80,000 hectares of downstream vegetable ground, which produces the arrangement that surprises people the first time they trace it. The lettuces, herbs and vegetables sold in the markets of this city are grown in significant part on the water this city already drank. Snowmelt comes off the Alborz. It is dammed, tunneled, filtered, and chlorinated. It is drunk, washed with, and flushed. It runs down 200 meters of grade into the sewers. It is treated again at the bottom. It goes onto fields. It grows food. The food comes back up the slope into the city on a truck. That is not waste disposal. That is a loop. And it is the only genuinely closed loop in the whole system. It is also, quietly, the most fragile thing in it. Because that arrangement has a condition attached. The farms downstream now depend on the city's used water arriving. They have planted for it. They have sized their operations around it. And treated effluent carries what the city put into it. Nitrate from the sewers, whatever industry contributed. The irrigation water recharges the shallow aquifer beneath those fields as it soaks in. So what the plain receives, the plain also stores. The city is not simply disposing of something downstream. It is writing into the groundwater under its own food supply. There is a version of this story that never mentions any of that. In that version, this is a weather story. A dry autumn arrived. The rain did not come. The reservoirs fell. A number was published. The number was small, and the world reported that a capital was 2 weeks from running out of water. Every part of that is factually accurate. And as an explanation, it is almost entirely wrong. Here is why. A city that supplies 70% of its drinking water from surface reservoirs is a city that has already accepted that the surface will sometimes fail. Snowpack varies. Rivers vary. That is what reservoirs are for. They exist precisely to carry a dry year. So the interesting question is never why the reservoirs were low. It is, what was the city drinking while they were? Because it did not stop drinking. 3 million cubic meters a day kept arriving. The taps in most of the city, most of the time, kept running. 70% of the supply comes from those 5 reservoirs. 30% does not. And when the 70 falls short, the 30 is asked to make up the difference. The 30 comes from underground. Southeast of the city, past the last of the suburbs, the ground flattens and opens out. This is the Varamin Plain. It is farmland, thousands of hectares of it, worked by more than 12,000 farmers, growing on a plain that receives around 100 millimeters of rain in a year. There is a dam for it. The Mamlu, 35 kilometers east of Tehran, holding around 250 million cubic meters, built to irrigate exactly this ground. Most of what it holds now goes north, into the city's drinking supply. The farms did not stop. They drilled. And this is the point where the whole system folds back on itself, so it is worth going slowly. Below Tehran and below the plains around it, the alluvium is layered. Coarse gravels that carry water easily, and between them, beds of fine silt and clay that do not. Inside those layers, the water is not just sitting in the gaps. It is holding the gaps open. Everything above, the sediment, the buildings, the roads, the whole weight of the city, presses down. That load is shared between 2 things: the grains of sediment touching each other and the pressure of the water in the pores between them. Take the water out, and the load does not go away. it transfers. The grains take the whole of it, and in the fine-grained layers, the silts and the clays, the structure cannot bear that. The particles rearrange, the pore space closes, the layer compacts. It does not open again. You can put the water back, a wet decade, a recharge program, a change in how the plain is farmed, and the water table will rise. But the space that held it is gone. The clay does not uncompact. The storage that was destroyed stays destroyed. That is what the word irrecoverable means in this context, and it is not rhetoric. It is a measurable property of the sediment. Which raises an obvious question. If it happens deep underground, in layers no one can see, how does anyone know it is happening at all? They watch from space. Radar satellites pass overhead on fixed orbits and bounce a signal off the ground. Compare the returning wave from one pass against the returning wave from a pass weeks later, and the difference in phase gives you the change in distance to the surface, down to the scale of centimetres. Mahdi Motar, a geodesist trained at the University of Tehran and now working at the German Research Center for Geosciences in Potsdam and at Leibniz University Hanover, has spent years doing exactly this over his own country. Working with Mahmoud Hagshenas Hagihi, he assembled a long-term analysis of the Tehran region, drawing on 4 different radar satellite systems across the years 2003 to 2017. They found 3 separate areas around the capital sinking at rates that at times exceeded 25 centimetres a year. Not in total, per year. Across the study period, cumulative subsidence in places measured in metres. Later work extended it. Using more than 6,000 satellite images between 2014 and 2020, they mapped the whole country at a 100-metre resolution and found around 56,000 square kilometres, about 3.5% of the national landmass, subsiding, with an annual depletion from confined and semi-confined aquifers estimated near 1.7 billion cubic metres. On the Varamin Plain, immediately southeast of the capital, rates above 31 centimetres a year. The plain that grows the city's vegetables is dropping about a foot a year. Now put that back into the machine. A buried pipe is fine when the ground moves uniformly. Everything settles together and the pipe goes down with it. Subsidence is not uniform. It is a bowl, deepest over the most depleted part of the aquifer, shallower at the edges. So a pipe crossing that bowl is bent. Slowly, continuously, over years. At the joints, the bending concentrates. And joints fail. So the network leaks more. And the water it leaks soaks back into the ground. Read that again, because it is the shape of the whole thing. The city pumps groundwater to cover a shortfall in surface supply. The pumping compacts the aquifer. The compaction bends and shears the distribution network. The damaged network loses more of the treated water it is carrying. And the response to losing more water is to pump more groundwater. The fix and the failure are the same action. The rest of the buried city is in that ground too. 7 metro lines, over 300 kilometers of track, more than 160 stations, several million passengers a day. And by one national assessment, 14 of Tehran's metro stations sit inside recognized subsidence zones. And underneath all of it, the 2,000 kilometers of tunnel nobody filled in. The qanats were dug to be self-supporting in ground that was moist and stable. Drain the ground, and the material dries, shrinks, and loses cohesion. Sections of tunnel collapse into voids. Voids migrate upward through loose alluvium over years, until the last few meters of roof cannot hold the street above. That has happened. In the south of the city, On Molavi Street, the ground opened above a collapsed qanat chain, a hazard that turned out to matter enormously to the tunnelling crews boring the eastern section of Metro Line 7 through the same ground. A 700-year-old water system killed by the wells that replaced it, taking the ceiling of the new one down with it. April 15, 2012. Rain falls hard across the city and runs off ground that has been paved over for decades. In the west, a channel wall on the Can River gives way. Around 1 million cubic meters of water and debris pour into the metro tunnels and run through the system for 30 hours. 3 stations flood. Trains are lost. Power is cut fast enough that nobody is killed, and 1,500 passengers are walked out of the adjacent stations in the dark. Line 4 was out of service for around 2 weeks. The city's water arrived where the city's transport was, and the transport stopped. So, what was that number counting? 14 million cubic meters behind a wall, divided by the daily draw of a city, giving 14 days. It was counting the visible part. The surface buffer, the water that sits behind concrete where a gauge can read it and a satellite can photograph it, and an official can be asked about it. It was never counting the other account. Because underneath the visible one, there is a second reserve, far larger, with no wall, no gauge, and no photograph. And that account had been in withdrawal for 60 years, since the wells replaced the qanats, since the plain was told to feed a country, since the deep aquifer became the thing you reached for whenever the surface came up short. There is no reading on it. It does not announce a percentage. It reports in one way only. The city goes down. 25 centimetres in a year. Then another 25 meters over a working lifetime. That is the statement of account. It is written into the ground, it is read from orbit, and every centimetre of it is a permanent reduction in the amount of water this place will ever be able to store again. 2 weeks was the answer to the wrong question. The right question was never how many days were left behind the wall. It was how much of the ground was left to lend. Stand on the northern edge of the city on a clear morning, and you can see almost the whole of it. Tochal rises directly behind you, close to 4,000 meters, with snow on the upper slopes into early summer. In front, the ground falls away for 200 meters over the width of the city, and the buildings go with it, and somewhere past the southern haze, the last suburbs give out onto the plain, and the plain gives out onto the edge of the dashed aquifer. Mountains behind, desert ahead, the city on the ramp between them. Every part of what we have followed is visible from that spot, and none of it looks like what it is. The valley to the northwest holds a wall from 1961 and 200 million cubic meters of stored river. The valley to the northeast holds another from 1967. Behind the volcano on the horizon sits a reservoir that has been quietly handing part of its contents back to the Caspian for 4 decades through channels cut before anyone was here to object. Somewhere out west, a 2-meter steel pipe runs 62 kilometers from a river that a city 3 generations ago had never needed. On every roof, a steel box turning drinking water into cloud. Under every street, a network laid decades ago, losing something like a third of what it carries into the gravel. Under that, 2,000 kilometers of abandoned tunnel. And under everything, the layers of clay that are holding this city up, one pumping season at a time. None of it works alone. That is the thing the dry year exposed, and it is the thing that was true in the wet years too. The dam is a power station, so the water level sets the electricity. The electricity runs the pumps, so the electricity sets how far the water climbs. The slope sets the pressure, so the geology decides which floors get served at 4 in the morning. The coolers spend the water because the air is dry, and the air is dry because of the ridge, and the ridge is the reason there is a city here that needs cooling in the first place. The city drinks the plain, and the plain grows the city's food, and the food comes back up the hill on the water that already went down it. Remove any one of those, and the arrangement does not degrade gracefully. It stops. There is a temptation, looking at all of it, to reach for the word failure. It is not the right word, and it is not fair to the people who built this. What is in these mountains is genuinely serious engineering. A 180-meter arch closed in 1961 in a country that had never built one. A treatment and transmission system that has kept a population rising from 900,000 to well over 10 million, supplied with clean water for 70 years, in a place with 200 millimeters of rain. Measured against what it was asked to do, it worked. It is still working. Most taps in this city ran through the driest autumn in living memory, and they ran because of decisions taken by people who are mostly dead now, in valleys most of the city has never visited. The problem was never the machine. The problem was what the machine made possible.
Every reservoir that came online bought a margin. And a margin, once you have it, stops feeling like a margin. It becomes the baseline. The city grew into it, the plain planted into it, and the consumption per person drifted upward until it settled at roughly twice what the planners had allocated. Each dam solved the shortage in front of it and enlarged the city that would create the next one. That is not an Iranian pattern. It is what every large city on dry ground has done, everywhere, for as long as there have been engineers willing to go and fetch water from somewhere else. Los Angeles did it. Madrid did it. Mexico City is doing it and sinking faster than this one. What makes this place worth looking at closely is not that it went wrong. It is that here, the accounting is unusually visible. Most cities hide their dependencies. Tehran cannot. Its slope is on the surface where you can walk it. Its reservoirs are photographed from orbit every few days. Its coolers are on the roof in plain sight. And the debt it has been running underground for 60 years is not hidden in a ledger somewhere. It is written into the elevation of the streets, a quarter of a meter at a time, where anybody with a radar satellite can read it. 2,500 years ago, someone on this plateau solved this problem with a technology that could not overdraw. Not because they were wiser than us, because they had no way to build a machine that could take more than the ground was willing to give. We built that machine. It was a real improvement. It fed more people, faster, on less labor, and it made cities like this one possible. It just never came with a governor. Perhaps what matters is not whether the rain returns to these mountains. It will, in some years more than others, as it always has. It is that a city's water was never really the thing behind the wall. It was the ground it was standing on, the slope it was built down, and the quiet arithmetic of 100 small dependencies nobody had reason to look at until the year the margin ran out. Thanks for watching. If you would like more journeys into the machinery that keeps places like this running, subscribe to Wired Earth, and I will see you on the next one.